The year was 1889, and Krakow was gripped by one of those winters that seemed determined to test the patience of the living. Snow came down in steady veils, layering the rooftops in white and muffling the sound of carriage wheels on the cobblestone streets. The city smelled faintly of coal smoke and river ice, and in the evenings the yellow glow of gas lamps blurred into soft halos in the mist. It was on such a night that she arrived. No one knew exactly where she came from, though the whispers began almost at once. Some said she was from Warsaw, fleeing a scandal too shameful to speak of. Others swore she had been a governess in Vienna who had married into money and then lost her husband in a hunting accident. But the carriage that brought her rattled in from the south road, its black lacquered sides gleaming wet from the melted snow, drawn by two tall bay horses whose breath steamed in the air. Inside sat a figure dressed in mourning black from the crown of her veiled hat to the tips of her kid leather boots. When the driver pulled to a halt in front of a stately townhouse on Ulica Kanonica, the door opened and she stepped out, one gloved hand gripping a small but well-crafted travel trunk, the other clutching a folded parasol. Her movements were measured, almost theatrical, the kind of grace that came from years of being watched and knowing it. Those who caught a glimpse of her face beneath the thin black veil spoke of skin so pale it almost reflected the lamplight, and eyes the color of polished walnut, deep and strangely unblinking. The widow, for so she was quickly named, did not acknowledge the curious faces peeking from behind curtains. She mounted the townhouse steps without a sound, her skirts whispering against the stone, and with a turn of an antique brass key, she disappeared inside. By morning, the neighborhood was humming with speculation. The townhouse itself was no ordinary property. Built in the mid-1700s, it had been owned by a family of merchants whose fortunes had long since withered. The house had been closed for years, its tall windows shuttered, its garden overgrown. Yet somehow, without anyone seeing a single workman, the place seemed alive again overnight. Curtains hung in the windows, the front brass polished to a shine, and the heavy door knocker gleamed as though it had just been cast. Inside, it was rumored, the walls were hung with paintings in the Viennese style, oil portraits of strangers no one could name, their expressions unreadable. The grocer's wife across the street swore she heard music drifting from the upstairs salon late at night. Low, haunting melodies played on a piano with a touch both delicate and deliberate. Men from the cafes began finding excuses to walk down Ulica Kanonica after dark, hoping for a glimpse of her at the window. The first to be rewarded was a tobacco merchant named Josef, who claimed she had looked directly at him from behind the lace curtain, her gaze lingering just long enough to make him stop in his tracks. In daylight, her appearances were rare. When she did venture out, it was always in the company of a young maid, her face half hidden beneath a parasol regardless of the weather. She spoke little, but her voice, when heard, was described as warm honey poured over something bitter. No one in Krakow could quite place her accent. There was Polish in it, yes, but softened by something else, perhaps Austrian, perhaps Hungarian. And then there was her jewelry, rings set with stones so dark they seemed to drink the light, and a brooch shaped like a coiled serpent, clasping a single drop of garnet. The most enduring curiosity was the absence of any family. She had no visiting relatives, no letters delivered by post that anyone noticed. She did not attend church, though her black attire might have made her blend seamlessly among the mourning benches. When asked, cautiously, about her late husband, she offered nothing more than a faint smile and the remark, "God takes us all, some sooner than others." Still, there was something about her that drew people in. Krakow in 1889 was a city where gossip could ruin a person. Yet it was also a place hungry for intrigue. The widow provided both. Wealthy men began calling at her townhouse, usually in the evenings, often leaving well past midnight. Their visits were never acknowledged by her in public, and the gentlemen themselves said little, though those who saw them afterward noted the dazed expressions and distracted air as though they had been somewhere far away. Her arrival, though quiet, was the opening move in a pattern that the city would come to know all too well. It was the kind of beginning that later, in the retelling, would be described with the fatalism of hindsight. How the first snowfall of that year had not been a blessing, but a shroud. Because from the moment she stepped down from that carriage, Krakow had welcomed not just a widow, but a shadow that would stretch far darker than the winter nights. And soon men would begin to vanish. It was during the long, frost-heavy weeks that followed her arrival that the widow's reputation began to take on the shimmer of legend. No one could say precisely when her evenings began to change from quiet solitude to gatherings that drew the city's most eligible and most affluent men. The invitations were never written, never sent by post. They came as murmured suggestions over coffee in the smoky warmth of the Planty cafes, or as a whispered mention from a friend who had happened to be passing her townhouse and caught the faint strains of a waltz drifting through the shutters. To be asked to spend an evening in her salon was to be given a ticket to an experience most would not describe plainly, though their eyes often gave away more than their words. Her drawing room was unlike anything else in Krakow. While the outside of the townhouse remained the austere facade of a merchant's residence, the interior seemed like a fragment of another world. Candles burned in crystal holders, their flames softened by shades of red silk that cast a warm, intimate glow over the faces of her guests. Heavy drapes in deep burgundy shut out the cold and the prying eyes of the street, while the scent of beeswax and something faintly floral, perhaps lilac, perhaps something rarer, hung in the air. At the far end of the room stood her piano, a black lacquered instrument whose surface gleamed like still water. She would sit there in a gown of black satin, edged with jet beads, her back straight, her fingers gliding over the keys with a touch both delicate and deliberate. When she played, conversation would falter. It was not just the music. Though she coaxed a sound from the instrument that seemed to hum in the bones, but the way her head would tilt slightly, as though listening to something only she could hear. More than one guest claimed that when she turned to glance over her shoulder, mid-phrase, her gaze lingered a fraction too long, pulling them into a quiet, unsettling stillness. She spoke little between pieces, offering instead a faint smile or a soft laugh that seemed to warm the room even as it made the listener uneasy. Wine flowed freely, but it was never the harsh, cheap vintage found in the taverns. Her bottles were old and imported, the sort that left a sweet burn in the throat and loosened tongues. In the flicker of candlelight, stories were told, political debates, tales of hunting expeditions, memories of travels in Vienna or Paris. But she herself shared almost nothing of her own past. Instead, she would draw her guests out with small, precise questions, the kind that made a man feel interesting, desired, seen. She leaned forward when she listened, her eyes fixed on his with such intensity that the rest of the room seemed to fade. It was this skill, perhaps even more than her beauty, that ensnared them. Her beauty, of course, was the other thing. In an era when pale skin was prized, hers seemed to have been painted in porcelain and touched with just enough color in the lips to suggest warmth. Her hair, always pinned in intricate coils, gleamed dark under the candlelight, and every so often a strand would fall loose against her cheek, an accident that felt rehearsed. Men would later recall the faint perfume she wore. Sweet at first, but with a note of something darker beneath, like the scent of lilies past their bloom. It was during these evenings that her true power became clear. She had a way of making each man believe he was the most important presence in the room. A touch to the sleeve, a glance that seemed to contain a secret, a low murmur of a name that made the syllables sound suddenly exotic. These were her tools. She never laughed too loudly, never allowed her gaze to stray inattentively. And while the evenings never descended into impropriety in the presence of others, there was always the sense that something might happen if one lingered after the others had gone. There were whispers, of course. The wives of certain men began to notice late returns, the faint smell of perfume clinging to a coat collar. Some claimed the widow had been seen walking arm in arm with gentlemen near the Vistula just before midnight, the mist curling around them like smoke. And yet, no one could fault her publicly. She had done nothing overt, nothing that could be named without revealing the speaker's own envy or suspicion. The salon became a place where men sought not only her company, but the peculiar intoxication that seemed to follow them home. Some returned again and again, their conversation in public becoming distracted, their health, though they did not notice, beginning to pale. A few looked as though they had been drained by some invisible means, but when asked, they would smile faintly and say they had been working too hard or sleeping too little. None ever spoke of the strange dreams they began to have, dreams in which she stood at the foot of their bed, her face hidden by a veil, her hands resting lightly on the chest, as though weighing something unseen. Oh, to sit in her salon was to step outside the ordinary rhythm of Krakow life, to enter a place where the hours seemed to loosen, and reality bent around candlelight and low music. Some claimed that the air itself was warmer there, more forgiving, as though the frost outside could not touch it. And yet, for all the pleasure it offered, the place carried a sense of inevitability, a slow pull towards something one could neither name nor resist. It was in this warmth, amid the velvet shadows and the haunting notes of her piano, that the trap was set, not with chains or locks, but with glances, words, and the quiet, careful work of seduction that would lead, as it always did, to something far colder. It began as a murmur, the kind of quiet talk exchanged in the corners of Krakow's cafes and over market stalls when the snow was still thick in the gutters. No one was certain when the first man vanished, only that it became impossible to ignore by the time there were three. The first was the tobacco merchant, Josef, the one who had been so pleased with himself for catching her gaze through the lace curtain that winter night. He had been seen entering her townhouse just after dusk, his coat collar turned up against the wind. By morning, he was gone. His friends assumed he had taken a trip, perhaps to Vienna or Luau on business. But the days stretched into weeks, and then into a month, and there was still no word. His shop remained closed, the blinds drawn. Soon after, a young barrister named Stanislaw was invited to one of her salons. He had spoken of it openly to his colleagues, boasting of her beauty and her strange, captivating manner. He, too, was last seen walking her home from a dinner party, his arm linked with hers as they passed beneath the gas lamps. His absence was noted more quickly, for he was due in court within 2 days, and his failure to appear sent his employer into a quiet panic. The third was a retired colonel, a man of some wealth who had survived 2 wars and the loss of a leg. He had been spotted more than once in the widow's company, always dressed impeccably, his medals glinting in the lamplight. After a late evening at her townhouse, his servant reported him missing, his bed unslept in, his clothes untouched. That was when the murmur became something heavier, something edged with fear. By the time the thaw began in early spring, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Men of means, men with reputations, men whose names carried weight, gone, each last seen in her company. Yet there was nothing to accuse her with, nothing tangible. Her door was never forced, her garden gates never ajar, and when the constable called, always politely, always with the air of one making a social call, she answered with grace. There was tea, there were polite refusals to comment on unfounded gossip, and there was that unsettling calm that made even the most determined visitor lose his nerve. Rumors began to curl like smoke through the city. Some said she was a black widow in the literal sense, a murderess who poisoned her lovers for their wealth. Others whispered of older, stranger origins, that she was something not entirely human, a creature whose beauty was a lure and whose appetite could never be satisfied. One man, emboldened by too much vodka, claimed to have followed her one night after she left her townhouse in a heavy cloak. He swore she had gone down toward the river, moving swiftly despite the ice, and that she had stood on the bank for nearly an hour, staring at the black water, as though waiting for something to surface. Meanwhile, small signs began to trouble the observant. The missing men's possessions, fine pocket watches, cufflinks, and even a gold-tipped cane, appeared at discreet auctions in the city, offered by sellers no one could quite identify. The goods were often bought quickly, with no questions asked, though the auctioneers later admitted the items had been brought in by a girl with dark hair, whose face they could not clearly recall. The most unnerving detail was that no bodies were found. Krakow was not a city where the dead could simply disappear without trace. In the past, victims of foul play had turned up eventually, washed ashore on the riverbank, uncovered in the fields beyond the city. But in these cases, the men had left nothing behind except the faintest traces. A glove dropped in the snow, a scarf snagged on a gate, a letter half-written and never sent. It was as if they had stepped out of their own lives entirely, leaving no path to follow. The police, pressed quietly by the families, began to take more interest. They questioned servants, shopkeepers, even cab drivers who might have driven her guests home. All claimed ignorance. Those few who had seen the missing men on the nights in question could not recall anything unusual, except perhaps that the gentleman had seemed dazed. One driver, an older man with a weather-beaten face, mentioned that he had once picked up a man outside her townhouse in the small hours. The man had been pale, unsteady on his feet, his collar turned up. He had asked to be taken to the river docks, but by the time they arrived, the passenger was gone, vanished without paying, without even opening the door. The driver swore the seat had still been warm. The widow herself remained untouched by suspicion in any formal sense. She still hosted her salon, still played her piano, still walked occasionally in the planty gardens when the snow turned to slush. If she noticed the glances from passers-by, she gave no sign. If she heard the whispers, she met them with the faintest curl of her lips, a smile that was not quite amused, not quite offended. And yet, for those who watched closely, something had shifted. Her maid, once cheerful in her errands, now kept her head down in the street, moving quickly, speaking to no one. The garden behind the townhouse, once a tangled mass of winter weeds, had been oddly cleared, the earth turned in neat, fresh mounds despite the lingering frost. The rose bushes, dormant and thorny, seemed already prepared for the bloom of summer, as though someone had been tending them with great care in the dead of winter. By the time the first warm winds of March brushed the city, the people of Krakow had begun to accept the disappearances as part of the city's private truth, unspoken, unproven, but undeniable. Men still visited her, though perhaps with a touch more caution, a touch more pride in their own imagined immunity. After all, they told themselves, not every guest vanished. But enough of them did. It was whispered among the men who had been to her townhouse more than once that there came a point, never on the first visit, sometimes not even on the second, when the evening would change. There would be the usual warmth of the salon. The candlelight pooled in amber glows against the burgundy drapes, the slow drift of piano music between bouts of quiet conversation. There would be the wine, as rich and dark as garnets, poured into cut crystal glasses that caught the light in strange patterns. But then, at some moment impossible to predict, she would set her glass aside, close the lid of the piano, and move with unhurried certainty toward the man she had chosen that night. She never made a scene of it. There was no coy giggle, no ostentatious display. Instead, it was as though the room itself shifted to accommodate her focus. Those who saw it, and later found the courage to describe it, said she would stand close enough for the faint scent of her perfume to touch them first. That same layered fragrance of something sweet, laced with a note just sharp enough to be unsettling. She would speak softly, often saying nothing more than his name, drawn out like a secret. Then she would place her gloved hand against the back of his neck. That touch was what stayed with them. Her fingers were warm at first, the pressure light, almost reassuring. But then there was the strange certainty that she was not merely touching them, but measuring them, as though her hand knew something about their pulse, their heat, their very life. More than one man spoke of a faint dizziness in that moment, a brief but undeniable sensation of being pulled toward her without thought. And always she would lean in, slowly enough to allow him to decide whether to meet her halfway, but with such inevitability that it hardly felt like a choice at all. The kiss itself was not hurried. Her lips were cool at first, then warmed, pressing in a way that seemed to both invite and demand. For some, it was intoxicating, a rush that left the blood thrumming in the ears. For others, it carried a strange stillness, as if the world outside that moment had ceased entirely. Yet each described the same peculiar detail afterward. The faintest ache at the nape of the neck where her fingers had pressed, and when they checked in the days that followed, small crescent-shaped marks, dark as bruises but too even, too precise, to be from chance or clumsiness. These marks, when spoken of at all, were explained away. A lover's grip, perhaps, the accident of a clasp on her glove. But the men who bore them often grew quieter in the weeks after, their faces losing some of their color, their eyes shadowed as though from sleeplessness. They began to walk more slowly, to eat less, to withdraw from company. A few of them left the city altogether without notice, though whether from choice or something else, no one could say. One man, a tailor's son named Marek, confided in a drinking companion that he had dreamt of her every night since that kiss. In the dreams, she stood at the foot of his bed, her veil drawn low, her gloved hand resting once again at the back of his neck. He would wake feeling both weak and feverishly alive, as though she had taken something from him but left something else in its place. Within a month, Marek was gone, his rented rooms abandoned, his debts unpaid. The ritual was not confined to the privacy of her home. A coachman swore he had seen her pause with a gentleman on the street one late evening, standing in the shadow of a church. She had reached up to adjust his scarf, her hand brushing the back of his neck, and in that instant, the man had gone still as a statue. Then she had leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, or perhaps his mouth. The coachman could not be certain, and the man had followed her away without another word. It was as if the touch and the kiss were a seal, a silent pact from which there was no turning back. The widow never seemed hurried afterward. She would return to her piano, her wine, her conversation as though nothing had happened, her chosen guest always departing later than the others. Those who saw the men afterward, those who ever saw them at all, claimed they walked as though in a dream, their movements deliberate, but lacking their usual spark. What unsettled the few who dared speak of it was how unremarkable it could seem at the time. In the soft glow of the salon, with the hum of music still in the air, the ritual could almost be mistaken for simple intimacy. It was only later, when the man began to fade from view, when his laughter lost its edge and his skin its warmth, that people remembered the press of her hand, the cool of her lips, and the marks that bloomed like dark petals where her fingers had been. By then, of course, it was far too late. It was a night when the fog lay heavy over Krakow, thick enough to blur the gas lamps into hazy spheres of light and soften the edges of the narrow streets. The city had settled into that muted stillness that comes when even the taverns have emptied, their last drinkers stumbling home or finding warmth in the shadows. Down on Ulica Kanonixa, the widow's townhouse stood as it always did, silent, dark from the street, save for the faintest glimmer of a candle in an upstairs window. The neighbor who lived 2 doors down, an aging bookseller named Roman, had been returning late from a meeting with a printer. He had taken the long way home to avoid the icy steps near the cathedral, passing instead along the quieter back lane behind the widow's garden. There, through the muffling fog, he heard something that made him stop mid-step, a sound sharp enough to slice through the night's stillness. It was not loud, but it was unmistakable, a muffled cry, half-choked, like someone calling out from far beneath the earth. Roman stood frozen, listening. The sound came again, fainter now, and he was certain it came from her garden. At first he thought of drunks or thieves, perhaps someone trying to scale the wall. But the tone of the cry was wrong. It was desperate, urgent, yet smothered. Instinct, or perhaps morbid curiosity, pushed him closer. The iron gate at the side of the house, which he had never once seen open, was ajar. Beyond it, the garden lay pale under the fog. The snow had been cleared in neat paths between the dormant rose bushes, their thorned canes clawing at the air. Near the center, the earth was bare, turned over into mounds of dark soil despite the lingering frost. There, 2 uniformed men, policemen, though out of their proper jurisdiction at that hour, were digging. Their shovels bit into the ground with a wet, sucking sound. Standing a few feet away, her arms folded neatly in front of her, was the widow herself, dressed not in her usual black satin, but in a long, heavy cloak. Her face was unreadable in the shadows, but Roman swore her eyes caught what little light there was, glinting as the officers worked. The digging stopped with a dull thud. One of the men knelt and brushed away the soil. The first thing Roman saw was a hand, white, stiff, the fingers curled inwards as if clenching something. Then the rest of the body was uncovered, a man still dressed in a fine evening suit, the silk tie twisted at the neck, his face pale and waxy in death, bore an expression Roman would never forget, a frozen mixture of bliss and horror. The lips curved faintly upward as though caught mid-smile, the eyes wide with something that was not joy. The second grave yielded another man older, his hair silvered, his lapel still pinned with a military medal. The third was younger, his face smooth, the traces of youth not yet erased by years. All 3 lay as though arranged deliberately, side by side, their hands folded over their chests. In the dim light, Roman thought he could see faint, crescent-shaped marks at the base of each man's neck. The policemen worked in grim silence, their breath clouding the cold air. One crossed himself before turning to the widow, muttering something too low for Roman to catch. She only inclined her head as if acknowledging a courtesy and pulled her cloak tighter. There was no sign of surprise in her demeanor, no outrage at the intrusion, no attempt to deny the grotesque tableau at her feet. Roman's heart hammered in his chest. Every instinct told him to step back, to vanish into the fog before anyone noticed him. But he could not move. He felt as though he were watching something ancient, something that had happened many times before and would happen again, no matter who stood witness. The roses behind the graves drew his attention. Though it was still the dead of winter, the bushes seemed unnaturally prepared for spring. Their canes had been pruned with precision, the soil at their roots freshly turned. Roman thought of the dark perfume that lingered in her salon, of the wine the color of blood, of the men who left looking pale and distracted, and of the strange warmth that clung to her garden even in the coldest months. One of the officers began to gather the shovels, speaking in a voice so low it was almost lost in the mist. The other looked up toward the widow as though expecting her to speak, but she said nothing. Finally, with a gesture that could have been dismissal, she turned and walked back toward the house, her steps unhurried, the hem of her cloak whispering against the path. The officers followed, leaving the bodies where they lay as if they were not evidence, but simply part of the earth itself. Roman backed away slowly, his breath shallow. He slipped through the gate and into the lane, moving quickly now, the image of those three faces burned into his mind. By the time he reached his own door, he had already decided he would say nothing. The men she took were not the kind who would be missed by people like him. Not loudly, not in public. And besides, there was something in the way she had stood there among them, calm and unshaken, that made him feel, speaking of it, would invite a gaze he did not wish to meet. The next morning, the garden gate was closed again, the paths neat, the roses undisturbed. There was no sign that the earth had been broken, no trace of the men who had lain beneath it only hours before. And from the upstairs window of the townhouse, as the fog burned away in the pale light of day, the faint strains of a piano drifted down into the street. The snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes, the kind that seemed to hang in the air before settling, as though the winter itself wished to prolong its grip on the city. Krakow's main station was alive with the restless noise of departure, steam hissing from the black iron engine, porters shouting to one another as they hefted trunks, travelers clutching tickets and scarves against the bite of the wind. It was the sort of night when most were eager to be anywhere but here. Yet among the rush of bodies moving toward the train, one figure stood apart. She was dressed entirely in black, as always, but this time the morning attire seemed almost ceremonial. The long coat was cut perfectly to her frame, the velvet catching stray flecks of snow like scattered stars. A veil of fine lace concealed her face, though enough could be seen to reveal the sharp line of her jaw, the pale skin beneath. Pinned to her chest was a single red rose, its color so vivid against the dark fabric that it seemed unreal, as though painted there. No luggage trailed behind her, only a small leather satchel, clasped tightly in one gloved hand. The other hand remained free, the black glove stretched smooth over her fingers, the same fingers that had rested at the necks of men who never return. She moved with the same unhurried grace she had in her salon, weaving through the crowd as though she belonged to a slower, more deliberate world than the one around her. A few of the station workers knew her by sight. They had seen her before, always at night, always alone, always boarding the later trains that slipped away into the countryside. None knew where she went, nor why she returned weeks or months later with the same satchel and the same rose. She had the sort of presence that discouraged questions. People simply stepped aside, lowering their eyes without quite realizing why. Tonight, though, there was something different in the air. Perhaps it was only the heavy snow and the way it muffled sound, or perhaps it was the knowledge that several men of standing had recently vanished. Men last seen not far from the street where she lived. Still, no one stopped her. No constable stepped forward to demand her papers. No traveler dared to offer her assistance. She walked to the platform as though it were her private domain, her steps light but precise, each one measured against the hiss of the engine. The train loomed before her, its carriages lit from within, the glow spilling into the fog that curled around the wheels. She paused for a moment at the edge of the platform, and in that pause the scene seemed to still. A porter, halfway through loading a crate, found himself staring, the sound of his own breath loud in his ears. She did not look at him directly, but her head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging his presence. In that moment, the man felt the air grow warmer, a strange sweet scent threading through the sharp smell of coal smoke. He realized his hand had tightened around the crate without his willing it. Then she moved again, placing one foot on the metal step and ascending into the carriage with the fluidity of someone stepping into a familiar room. The veil shifted with the movement, and for the briefest instant, her lips were visible, pale, precise, curved in something that was not quite a smile. The rose at her chest brushed the doorway as she passed inside. Those who noticed her, truly noticed her, could not shake the impression that she was leaving for more than a journey. She was departing in the way a shadow leaves a room silently, but with the undeniable sense that something has been taken with it. One old man at the far end of the platform muttered to himself in Polish, words half lost beneath the hiss of the engine, about women who wore red in winter and traveled alone, and how such things never ended well for those who crossed their path. A sharp whistle cut through the night, and the train began to shudder, wheels grinding against the rails. Steam poured upward in a great white cloud, swallowing the platform. When it cleared, the black-clad figure was no longer visible in the window. The porter who had seen her ascend could not say whether she had taken a seat or moved deeper into the carriage out of sight. The train picked up speed, its lanterns casting long, flickering shapes across the snow as it pulled away from the station. The crowd began to thin, the noise of departure replaced by the ordinary rhythm of the night. Only the old man remained at the edge of the platform, watching the last carriage disappear into the fog. He did not turn away until the sound of the wheels had faded to nothing, and when he finally left, he crossed himself 3 times without breaking stride. By morning, the snowfall had erased all traces of the night's departure. The rose petals, a few of which had loosened and fallen to the platform as she passed, lay half buried in the white drift. And somewhere far from Krakow, in the shadowed interior of a sleeping train, a gloved hand rested lightly on the back of a man's neck.